The morning sun cast long shadows across the ancient corridors of Buckingham Palace as King Charles III sat in his private study. A room that had witnessed centuries of royal decisions. The weight of the crown seemed heavier than usual that day. Papers lay scattered across his mahogany desk, each one containing information that would change the course of his reign and the life of his queen consort. Camilla Charles had always been a man of duty, raised from birth to understand that personal feelings often took second place to the needs of the monarchy. But what lay before him now was different. This was not about tradition or protocol. This was about trust, family, and the very foundation of the institution he had sworn to protect. The king picked up a document marked with the royal seal. His hands trembled slightly as he read through the findings once more. Members of Camilla's family had been involved in activities that could bring scandal to the throne. The evidence was undeniable. Phone records, financial transactions, testimonies from reliable sources painted a picture that Charles could no longer ignore. For weeks, it struggled with this knowledge alone. Sleep had become a distant memory as he paced his chambers night after night, wrestling with what had to be done. He loved Camilla deeply. Their journey to marriage had been long and painful, marked by public scrutiny and endless criticism. They had weathered storms together that would have broken lesser couples. But this was different. This touched the very core of what the monarchy represented to the British people. Charles had spent his entire life preparing to be king, and he understood that some decisions could not be delayed or softened by sentiment. The institution was bigger than any individual, bigger than his own happiness. Outside his window, the palace gardens stretched out in perfect geometric patterns. Gardeners moved methodically through the flower beds, maintaining the beauty that tourists came from around the world to admire. Everything about the palace spoke of order, tradition, and continuity. Charles knew that maintaining that order sometimes required painful choices. He thought back to his mother, Queen Elizabeth II, and the difficult decisions she had made during her reign. She had always put duty first, even when it meant personal sacrifice. He remembered her strength during family crises, her unwavering commitment to the crown above all else. Now, wearing that same crown, Charles understood her burden in ways he never had before. The king stood and walked to the window. Palace guards stood at attention below, their red uniforms bright against the gray stone. They represented something unchanging in a world of constant flux. Charles knew that his decision would shock them, shock the entire nation. But he also knew it was necessary. He had scheduled a private meeting with Camilla for that afternoon. The thought of it made his chest tighten with anxiety. How do you tell the woman you love that her family can no longer be part of royal life? How do you explain that the people she holds dear must be cut off from the privileges and access they have enjoyed? Charles returned to his desk and began to write. He needed to organize his thoughts, to find the right words for an impossible conversation. The pen moved slowly across the paper as he composed what he would say. Every sentence had to be carefully chosen. This was not just a husband speaking to his wife. This was a king, making a decision that would affect the monarchy for generations to come. The grandfather clock in the corner struck 11. Time was moving forward whether Charles was ready or not. He folded the paper and placed it in his jacket pocket. There would be no turning back from this moment. Once the words were spoken, everything would change. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. His private secretary entered, carrying more documents that required the royal signature. Charles signed them mechanically, his mind elsewhere. The secretary noticed the king's distracted state but said nothing. Those who worked closest to the monarch had learned to read his moods and respect his privacy. After the secretary left, Charles allowed himself one moment of weakness. He placed his head in his hands and let out a long breath. The loneliness of leadership had never felt more acute. This was a decision he had to make alone, and he would bear the consequences alone. He thought of Camilla, probably in her sitting room at that moment, unaware of what was coming. She had been his companion through so much, his support when the world seemed against them. She had accepted the role of queen consort with grace, despite knowing that many in the public still harbored resentment toward her. But Charles also thought of the people of Britain, the Commonwealth, and the legacy he would leave behind. A monarch's first duty was to protect the crown, to ensure its survival and respect. Personal happiness, no matter how precious, could not come at the cost of the institution's integrity. The king stood once more and straightened his jacket. The meeting with Camilla was in 3 hours. He would use that time to prepare himself mentally for what had to be done. There would be tears, certainly. There would be anger and hurt. But there would also be understanding, eventually. Camilla was not naive. She understood the demands of royal life better than most. As Charles walked toward the door of his study, past a portrait of his mother, her painted eyes seemed to watch him with that mixture of warmth and steel that had characterized her reign. He stopped and looked at the portrait for a long moment. Then he nodded slightly, as if receiving permission from beyond the grave. The decision was made. Now came the hardest part, living with it. The afternoon light filtered through the tall windows of the Queen Consort's private sitting room. Camilla sat with her needlework, though her hands moved without their usual precision. She had sensed something was wrong for days now. Charles had been distant, preoccupied in a way that went beyond his normal duties as king. A servant entered and informed her that His Majesty requested her presence in the library. The formal tone of the message sent a chill down her spine. In their private moments, Charles never sent formal requests. He would simply appear at her door or send a warm, personal note. This felt different. Official, cold-taught Camilla set down her needlework and checked her appearance in the mirror. She had learned long ago to maintain composure regardless of inner turmoil. Years of public scrutiny had taught her to keep her face neutral, her posture perfect. Whatever was coming, she would face it with the dignity expected of a queen consort. The walk to the library felt longer than usual. Her footsteps echoed on the marble floors as she passed portraits of former queens and kings. Each face seemed to watch her with knowing eyes, as if they understood something she did not. Palace staff nodded respectfully as she passed, but she noticed something in their expressions. Pity, perhaps? Or was she imagining it? When she entered the library, Charles stood with his back to her, staring out at the gardens. He did not turn immediately when she entered. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken words. Finally, he turned to face her. And Camilla saw the pain in his eyes. She knew then that whatever was coming would change everything. In all their years together, through scandal and public hatred, through the death of Diana and the long wait to marry, she had never seen him look quite like this. This was not the face of her husband. This was the face of a king bearing an impossible burden. Charles gestured for her to sit, but she remained standing. Some conversations, she knew instinctively, were better faced on your feet. He moved closer and took her hands in his. They were cold, despite the warm afternoon. The words came slowly at first, then in a rush. Her family members had been involved in activities that compromised the monarchy. There were business dealings that exploited royal connections. There were comments to the press that had been traced back to sources too close to be coincidental. There were financial irregularities that could not be overlooked. Camilla felt the blood drain from her face. She had always known her family was not perfect. They lacked the generations of training and discretion that characterized the traditional royal family. They were more casual, more modern in their approach to life. But this? She had never imagined this. Charles continued speaking, his voice steady but strained. The decision had been made. Her close family members would be distanced from all official royal functions. Their access to palace events would be restricted. They would no longer receive the privileges that came with being relatives of the queen consort. In essence, they were being cut off. She pulled her hands away from his, not in anger but in shock. Her mind raced through the implications. Her children, her siblings, her extended family, all would be affected by this decree. Family gatherings would never be the same. The casual integration of her relatives into royal life that she had worked so hard to achieve would be dismantled overnight. But even as her heart broke, Camilla understood. She had lived in the shadow of the crown long enough to know that it demanded sacrifices that ordinary people never had to consider. She thought of the late Queen Elizabeth, who had navigated her own family crises with steely resolve. She thought of the weight that Charles now carried, and how impossible this decision must have been for him. She walked to the window where he had been standing earlier. Below, Tourists gathered at the palace gates, taking photographs and hoping for a glimpse of royalty. They saw the glamour, the crowns and carriages. They did not see moments like this, when duty crushed personal happiness beneath its weight. Charles came to stand beside her. He did not touch her, sensing that she needed space to process what she had heard. They stood in silence for several minutes, two people who loved each other facing a chasm that duty had placed between them. Finally, Camilla spoke. Her voice was quiet, but controlled. She asked about the evidence, and Charles provided details. Each piece of information felt like a small betrayal, not by him, but by those she had trusted. Her family had put her in this position. They had jeopardized everything she and Charles had built together. She asked if there was any other way, knowing the answer before he responded. Charles shook his head. The decision had been reviewed by advisors, legal experts, and trusted confidants. There was no alternative that protected both the monarchy and her family. A choice had been made, and it was the only choice possible. Camilla felt tears threatening, but refused to let them fall. Not now, not here. She would maintain her composure as she had been trained to do. Later, in the privacy of her chambers, she could allow herself to grieve. But in this moment, she was the queen consort, and she would act accordingly. She turned to Charles and nodded slowly. She understood his position, even if her heart rebelled against it. She knew he had not made this decision lightly. She could see the cost of it written in every line of his face. In the slump of his shoulders that he tried to hide, Charles reached for her again, and this time she allowed it. They stood together in the fading afternoon light, two people bound by love and duty in equal measure. No words were necessary. They had survived scandals and tragedy before. They would survive this too, though both knew they would be changed by it. As the sun set over Buckingham Palace, casting the library in shades of gold and amber, Camilla made her own silent vow. She would support Charles in this decision, no matter how much it hurt. She would stand by him as queen consort, putting the crown before personal feeling. It was what was required, and she had never been one to shirk her responsibilities. But she also knew that something between them had shifted in that library. A line had been crossed, a price had been paid. Their relationship would continue, but it would bear the scar of this afternoon forever. The news spread through Buckingham Palace like wildfire, though no official announcement had been made. Palace staff had ways of knowing when something significant was happening. The whispered conversations that stopped when others approached. The somber expressions on the faces of senior advisors, the unusual comings and goings from the king's private offices all pointed to a crisis. The royal guards, standing at their posts throughout the palace, were among the first to notice the change. These men and women, trained to maintain perfect stillness and neutral expressions regardless of what unfolded around them, found themselves witnesses to something unprecedented. They saw the queen consort leave the library with red-rimmed eyes, despite her composed face. They noticed the king walking the palace corridors late at night, alone with his thoughts. Commander James Hartley, head of the palace guard detail, had served the royal family for 23 years. He had protected Queen Elizabeth II, stood watch during state funerals, and witnessed countless royal dramas from his professional distance. But what he was observing now troubled him in ways he could not quite articulate. During his evening briefing with the king's private secretary, fragments of information emerged. There would be changes to the guest lists for upcoming events. Certain individuals would no longer have automatic access to palace grounds. New security protocols were being implemented not to keep out strangers, but to restrict family members. Hartley shared this information with his most trusted guards during their shift change. Their reactions ranged from shock to confusion. The royal family was meant to present a united front to the world. Whatever was happening behind palace walls was serious enough to shatter that carefully maintained image. Sarah Mitchell, one of the guards posted outside the queen consort's chambers, had noticed the increased tension firsthand. She had heard raised voices one evening, though she could not make out the words. She had seen Camilla's children arrive for what should have been a routine family dinner, only to leave within the hour looking devastated. The guards talked among themselves in the rare moments when they could speak freely. They pieced together what they could from fragments overheard, from the body language of those they protected, from the unusual movements within the palace. A picture was forming, though none of them wanted to believe it. King Charles was cutting off the Queen Consort's family. The why remained unclear, but the fact was becoming undeniable. Invitations were being rescinded. Access was being restricted. The integration of Camilla's relatives into royal life, something that had taken years to achieve, was being systematically dismantled. For the guards, this was more than palace gossip. It represented a fundamental shift in the dynamics of the monarchy they served. They had watched Charles and Camilla's relationship evolve from scandal to acceptance to marriage. They had seen the couple work to build bridges between the traditional royal family and Camilla's more ordinary relatives. Now those bridges were being burned. Lieutenant David Chen, a 10-year veteran of the palace guard, found himself stationed outside the king's study the night after the library meeting. Through the heavy door, he could hear the sound of pacing. The king was alone, walking back and forth for hours. Chen maintained his position without moving, but inside he felt a profound sadness for the man behind that door. The human side of royalty was something guards saw but never discussed publicly. They witnessed private moments of grief, anger, and fear. They saw the royals without their public masks. Chen had enormous respect for Charles, for the way he carried impossible responsibilities with grace. To hear him pacing in solitary anguish was deeply affecting. Other guards reported similar observations. The king was sleeping little. The Queen Consort had canceled several private engagements. The atmosphere in the palace had shifted from its usual formal warmth to something colder, more tense. Even the staff who maintained the grounds and served meals felt it. In the guards' quarters, during meal breaks and shift changes, the conversations kept returning to the same questions. What could have happened to cause such a dramatic action? How bad must things be for a king to essentially exile his wife's family? The guards had no answers, only observations and growing concern. Some of the older guards remembered other royal family crises. They recalled the turmoil during Charles and Diana's marriage breakdown. They remembered the shock of Diana's death and the difficult years that followed. They had seen Prince Andrew's scandals and the departure of Harry and Meghan. But this felt different because it was more personal, more painful. Charles had finally found happiness with Camilla after decades of public criticism and personal struggle. Everyone who worked at the palace had seen how devoted they were to each other. To watch that relationship now strained by duty and necessity was troubling even to those trained not to have opinions about such matters. Lieutenant Emily Watson, stationed near the formal dining room, witnessed a particularly heartbreaking moment. The king and queen consort were having dinner, just the two of them. Usually their private dinners were filled with quiet conversation and occasional laughter. That evening, they ate in near silence. The distance between them, at the table, seemed to represent a larger gulf that words could not bridge. Watson had to look away, feeling like an intruder on private grief. She wondered how they would move forward from this. Could a marriage survive when duty demanded such personal sacrifice? Could love endure when one partner had to essentially disown the other's family? The palace guards took their duties seriously. They were meant to be invisible, present, but unnoticed. Yet they were also human beings who could not help but be moved by what they witnessed. The unfolding drama was affecting them in ways that surprised even the most seasoned among them. Commander Hartley called a special meeting with his senior staff. He reminded them of their professional obligations. Whatever they witnessed, whatever they heard, had to remain confidential. The royal family deserved their privacy, especially during difficult times. Any guard found gossiping or leaking information would face immediate dismissal. His words were met with solemn nods. These men and women understood the gravity of their position. They had been entrusted with protecting not just the physical safety of the royals, but also their dignity and privacy. No matter how moved they were by what they witnessed, their duty was clear. Yet as the days passed, the strain remained visible. The guards stood at their posts with perfect military bearing, but their eyes held knowledge that weighed heavily. They had seen behind the curtain of royalty and witnessed the very human pain that titles and crowns could not protect against in the quiet hours of night shifts. When the palace slept and only guards prowled the corridors, there was time to reflect. They thought about the nature of duty, about the sacrifices required of those who served the crown, whether as soldiers or as sovereigns. They thought about King Charles, alone with his decisions, and Queen Consort Camilla, facing the dissolution of her family's place in royal life. The speechlessness they felt was not from shock or scandal, but from recognizing the profound sadness of the situation. They were witnessing a tragedy playing out in slow motion, and there was nothing they could do but stand watch and bear silent. Witness to history being made in the most painful of ways. The formal announcement came on a gray Thursday morning. The palace press office released a carefully worded statement about restructuring of royal household access and a renewed focus on core family members for official duties. To the casual reader, it might have seemed like routine administrative news. To those who understood palace language, it was a seismic shift. Tom Parker Bowles, Camilla's son, read the statement on his phone while having coffee in his London flat. The words were diplomatic, even gentle, but their meaning was unmistakable. He and his sister Laura, along with other family members, were being quietly removed from the inner circle of royal life. His first instinct was anger. He called his sister immediately. Laura had already heard, and her voice was thick with tears. They had both worked hard to navigate their unusual position as stepchildren to the king. They had been careful, respectful, mindful of protocol. What had gone wrong? The siblings decided to request a meeting with their mother. Getting time with the queen consort was no longer as simple as calling her mobile phone. Everything now went through private secretaries and scheduling coordinators. Even this small change illustrated how much their relationship had been altered by circumstance. When the meeting was finally arranged, it took place not in the informal family quarters where they usually visited their mother, but in a formal receiving room. The setting itself sent a message. This was official, not familial. Camilla entered looking tired, but composed. She embraced her children, and for a moment, the formality melted away. But when they sat down to talk, the queen consort's face became guarded. She explained what she could, though much remained unsaid. There had been issues, problems that could not be overlooked. The king had made a decision, and she supported it. Tom pressed for details. What exactly had happened? Who was responsible? Could it be fixed? His mother shook her head slowly. Some things once broken could not be easily repaired. The monarchy operated by different rules than ordinary families. What might be forgiven in private life could not be tolerated when it threatened the institution. Laura asked the question that hurt most. Did this mean they were no longer welcome? Were they being punished for something they had not done? Camilla reached for her daughter's hand. Of course, they were still loved, still family. But their role would be different now. More private, less public. It was not about punishment, but about protection of the crown. The conversation lasted 2 hours, but many questions remained unanswered. When Tom and Laura left the palace that afternoon, they felt as though they had lost something irreplaceable. The special position they had held, awkward as it sometimes was, had given them a unique place in British public life. Now that was gone. Within Camilla's extended family, the reactions varied. Some family members were defiant, insisting they had done nothing wrong and demanding explanations. Others were apologetic, recognizing that their actions, however innocent they had seemed at the time, had consequences they had not anticipated. Camilla's brother, Mark Shand, would have been devastated by the family rupture. His death years earlier meant he was spared this particular pain. But Camilla thought of him often during these difficult days. He had understood the challenges she faced in marrying Charles. He would have understood this too, the business associates and friends, who had enjoyed proximity to royal circles through their connections too. Camilla's family found themselves quietly distanced. Invitations to events were not renewed. Calls were not returned with the same promptness. The subtle web of influence and access that had developed over years was being systematically dismantled. For Camilla, watching her family deal with the fallout was agonizing. She had tried to prepare them for life adjacent to royalty, had warned them about the scrutiny and expectations. But clearly her warnings had not been sufficient. Or perhaps the temptations that came with royal connection were simply too powerful for some to resist. She spent long hours in her private sitting room, staring at family photographs. Pictures of her children as babies, of family holidays before Charles was in her life, of simpler times when being ordinary was enough. Those days seemed impossibly distant now. Charles, too, was struggling with the aftermath of his decision. He had expected criticism, had braced himself for Camilla's pain. What he had not fully anticipated was his own sense of loss. Her family, for all their faults, had welcomed him in ways his own family sometimes had not. They had been warm, accepting, normal. He would miss that more than he had imagined. The couple's private dinners remained strained. They spoke of daily matters, of schedules and duties, but the deeper conversation about what had happened remained difficult. Each knew the other was hurting. Each wanted to comfort the other, but the wound was too fresh. The situation too complex for easy reassurance. Prince William reached out to his father during this time. As heir to the throne, he understood the weight of duty and the difficult choices it sometimes demanded. He offered his support and his understanding. It meant more to Charles than he could express. William had his own complicated relationship with Camilla. Born from loyalty to his late mother Diana, but he had come to respect his stepmother and recognize the happiness she brought his father. Seeing them both in pain troubled him, even as he acknowledged the necessity of what had been done. The staff at Buckingham Palace moved through their duties with heightened sensitivity. They understood that they were serving a family in crisis, though that crisis must never be acknowledged publicly. Extra care was taken with the king's meals, knowing he was eating little. The queen consort's favorite flowers appeared in her rooms more frequently. Small gestures of support that could not be spoken aloud in the evenings. When official duties were complete, Charles often walked the palace corridors alone. The portraits of his ancestors watched him as he passed. He wondered what they would think of his decision. His mother would have approved, he felt certain. She had always put duty first. But his father, Prince Philip, might have handled things differently. With his more direct and sometimes brutal honesty, Camilla established a new routine for herself. She threw herself into her royal duties with increased vigor. Charity work, public appearances, official engagements, all became ways to channel her grief into something productive. If she could not fix her personal situation, she could at least serve the role she had been given with dignity. Her staff noticed that she arrived earlier for briefings and stayed later after events. She asked more questions, took more interest in the details of every project. It was as if she was trying to prove her worth, to demonstrate that despite everything, she was committed to being an exemplary queen consort. At night, alone in her chambers, the facade would crack. She allowed herself tears that no one witnessed. She grieved not just for her family's lost position, but for the innocence that had been shattered. She had always known that royal life demanded sacrifice, but understanding it intellectually was different from living it emotionally. Charles, in his own rooms, dealt with similar private anguish. He second-guessed his decision even while knowing it had been necessary. Could there have been another way? Should he have acted sooner or differently? The questions circled endlessly in his mind, with no satisfying answers. What neither of them fully realized yet was that this crisis, painful as it was, would ultimately redefine their marriage and their roles. They were being forged in fire, tested in ways they had not anticipated. Whether they would emerge stronger or permanently scarred remained to be seen. 3 weeks after the decision had been made, something shifted in the palace. The initial shock had settled into a new reality, one that everyone was learning to navigate. The king and queen consort were finding their way back to each other. Though the path was not straightforward, it began with small moments. Charles appeared at Camilla's door one evening with a pot of her favorite tea. They sat together in silence at first, then slowly began to talk about things other than the crisis. They discussed a book she was reading, a documentary he had watched, memories from years past. The conversation was gentle, healing in its ordinariness. Camilla, for her part, began to understand the full weight of what Charles had carried alone. She learned more about the evidence that had forced his hand, the advice he had received, the sleepless nights he had endured before making his decision. Her anger and hurt began to transform into something more complex, a recognition of the impossible position he had been in. One breakthrough came during a state dinner. It was their first major public appearance together since the family restructuring had been announced. The palace staff watched nervously, unsure how the couple would present themselves. Would the strain be visible? Would they maintain their usual warmth? As they entered the banquet hall, Charles placed his hand on the small of Camilla's back, a familiar gesture of connection. She looked up at him and smiled. And for the first time in weeks, it was a real smile. The relief among the staff was palpable. Whatever private pain the couple carried, they were united in public. The dinner went smoothly, and afterward, walking back to their private quarters, Charles and Camilla talked more openly than they had since the library conversation. Camilla expressed her grief, her anger at her family members, who had put them in this position, her fear about what the future held. Charles listened without defending his decision, simply being present for her pain. In turn, Charles shared his own struggles. The guilt he felt for causing her suffering, the fear that he had damaged their relationship beyond repair, the loneliness of making decisions that affected those he loved. Camilla took his hand as they walked, a simple gesture that meant everything. The palace guards noticed the change. Commander Hartley, doing his evening rounds, saw the light in the king's study burning late. But this time there were two silhouettes visible through the curtained windows. The couple was together, talking, beginning the work of rebuilding what had been fractured. In the following days, Camilla made a decision of her own. She would reach out to those family members who had been cut off and have honest conversations with them. She would not undermine Charles's decision, but she would not abandon her family either. She would find a way to maintain personal relationships, while respecting the necessary professional distance. These conversations were difficult. Some family members were angry and unwilling to understand the larger picture. Others were defensive, insisting they had been unfairly judged. But a few, particularly her children, began to see the situation from a different perspective. They recognized that their mother was caught between impossible loyalties, and they chose to support her rather than add to her burden. Tom came back to visit his mother, this time in the private family quarters rather than a formal room. He apologized for his initial reaction, for not understanding the pressure she was under. He pledged to respect the boundaries that had been set, while maintaining his love and support for her. It was a conversation that left them both in tears, but also feeling closer than they had in years. Laura followed soon after with a similar visit. The sisters-in-law, Tom's wife Sarah, and Laura's husband Harry, also reached out to Camilla, offering their understanding and support. These personal connections, away from the formality of palace life, became lifelines for Camilla. Charles, witnessing his wife's strength in navigating these relationships, fell in love with her all over again. He had always admired her resilience, but watching her find grace in such difficult circumstances deepened his respect and affection. He began to look for ways to show his support without undermining the necessary boundaries he had established. Small gestures accumulated. He surprised her with weekend trips to their private estate, where they could escape palace formality. He made time in his busy schedule for private lunches together. He listened when she needed to talk, and gave her space when she needed solitude. The marriage began to heal. The turning point came during a private moment in the gardens. They were walking together on a crisp autumn morning, the kind of day where breath becomes visible in the cool air. Camilla stopped at a bench where they had sat many times before and turned to Charles. She told him that she forgave him, not because the decision had stopped hurting, but because she understood why it had been necessary. She told him that she knew he had acted out of duty, not cruelty. She acknowledged that being Queen Consort meant accepting sacrifices she had not fully understood until now. Charles felt something release in his chest, a tension he had been carrying for weeks. He took her hands and told her that her forgiveness meant everything, but that he did not want her to shoulder the burden alone. They were in this together, and together they would find a way forward. They sat on that bench for a long time, talking about the future. They discussed how to maintain family connections privately while upholding public boundaries. They talked about the legacy they wanted to leave and how this crisis might actually strengthen the monarchy by showing that it could make difficult decisions when it's necessary. Most importantly, they remembered why they had chosen each other in the first place. Despite decades of obstacles, Despite scandal and criticism, despite the weight of the crown, they had found love. That love had been tested, certainly, but it had not broken. If anything, it was being tempered into something stronger back in the palace. The staff began to notice the change in atmosphere. The tension that had hung over everything for weeks was lifting. The king and queen consort were seen laughing together again. Small touches of affection reappeared in their public interactions. The palace felt less like a prison and more like a home. The guards, too, sensed the shift. Lieutenant Watson, standing her post outside the formal dining room one evening, heard the sound of genuine laughter coming from within. It was the kind of sound that had been absent for too long, and its return felt like spring after a harsh winter. Commander Hartley updated his staff during their briefing. The immediate crisis appeared to be resolving. The king and queen consort were finding their equilibrium. The guards were reminded once again of their duty to protect not just physical safety, but privacy and dignity. What they had witnessed in recent weeks must remain confidential. As autumn deepened into winter, Charles and Camilla settled into their new reality. Some family relationships remained strained and might never fully recover. The public perception of the royal family had shifted subtly, with some praising the king's firm leadership and others criticizing what they saw as heartless treatment of family. But within the palace walls, within the private space that only they truly inhabited, something important had been preserved. The marriage had survived its greatest test. The love between them had proven resilient. They had learned that duty and personal happiness could coexist, though not without cost. Charles looked at his wife with new appreciation. She had every right to resent him, to withdraw her affection, to make his life miserable. Instead, she had chosen understanding. She had chosen to see his burden rather than just her own pain. She had chosen them over bitterness. Camilla looked at her husband with similar new understanding. She saw the weight he carried with greater clarity now. She recognized the loneliness of leadership, the isolation that came with wearing the crown. She chose to stand beside him in that isolation, to share the burden even when it cost her dearly. Their love story had always been unconventional, marked by obstacles and opposition. This was just another chapter in a long, complicated journey. But as they faced it together, they discovered reserves of strength they had not known they possessed. 6 months had passed since that afternoon in the library when everything changed. The palace had settled into its new rhythm, and what had once seemed impossible had become the new normal. The scars remained, but they were healing in ways that surprised everyone involved. Christmas at Sandringham was approaching, and decisions had to be made about family gatherings. This would be the first major holiday since the restructuring, and everyone knew it would be different. Charles and Camilla discussed the arrangements carefully, trying to balance duty with compassion, tradition with their new reality. In the end, they decided on a compromise that felt right to both of them. The official Christmas celebrations would include only core members of the royal family, as protocol now demanded. But on Boxing Day, Camilla would host a private gathering with her children and close relatives at a nearby estate. Charles would make an appearance, showing support for his wife while maintaining the necessary boundaries. The decision pleased no one entirely, but it represented progress. It acknowledged that while public roles had changed, private relationships could still be maintained. It was a solution that honored both the monarchy and the family. Even if imperfectly, the Christmas Eve service at Sandringham was watched closely by the public and press. How would the king and queen consort present themselves? Would there be visible tension? The couple arrived together, her hand tucked into his arm, both smiling warmly at the gathered crowd. If they carried private pain, it was invisible to observers. Inside the church, during the service, Camilla found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought her to this moment. She thought about the young woman she had been, falling in love with a prince she could not marry. She remembered the years apart, the scandal of their affair, the tragedy of Diana's death, and the blame that had been directed at her. She recalled the long wait to marry Charles, the public's slow, grudging acceptance of her, the nervous joy of finally becoming his wife. She thought about becoming queen consort, a title she had never imagined holding, and all the responsibilities it brought. And she thought about the last 6 months, perhaps the most difficult of her life. Through it all, one truth remained constant. She loved Charles, and he loved her. That love had been tested by circumstances, scrutiny, duty, and sacrifice. It had bent but not broken. Looking at him now, standing beside her as they sang hymns, surrounded by ancient traditions, she felt a profound gratitude for what they had survived together. Charles, too, was lost in thought during the service. He thought about his mother and the lessons she had taught him about duty. He remembered her telling him that being monarch meant making choices others could not understand, bearing burdens others could not see. He understood those words now in ways he never had before. He thought about the decision he had made regarding Camilla's family. 6 months later, he still believed it had been necessary, but he also understood its costs more fully. He had asked Camilla to sacrifice her family's position for the good of the crown, and she had done so with a grace that humbled him. He would spend the rest of his life trying to be worthy of that sacrifice. After the service, during the traditional Christmas lunch at Sandringham, the atmosphere was warm despite the absent faces. William and Kate were there with their children, providing energy and laughter. The grandchildren helped bridge awkward moments, their innocence and joy reminding everyone what truly mattered. Prince George, being older now, sensed that something was different about this Christmas, but he did not ask questions. Princess Charlotte and Prince Louis were simply happy to be with family, opening presents and eating too many sweets. Their presence was a gift to Charles and Camilla, a reminder of continuity and hope. On Boxing Day, Camilla's private gathering went better than she had dared hope. Tom and Laura were there with their families, as were a few other carefully selected relatives. The mood was subdued compared to previous years, but it was also honest. Everyone present understood what had happened and why. There was no pretense, no forced cheerfulness, just family trying to find a new way forward. When Charles arrived for tea, there was a moment of awkwardness, but Tom stood and greeted his stepfather with genuine warmth, and the tension eased. They would never go back to what they had been before, but they could perhaps build something new. Something more honest, if more limited. As winter gave way to spring, the palace found its rhythm again. The guards stood their posts, the staff managed the household, and the king and queen consort fulfilled their duties. The crisis that had shaken everything had been absorbed into history. Another chapter in the long, complicated story of the British monarchy, Commander Hartley, reflecting on the past months during a quiet moment in his office, felt he had witnessed something important. He had seen how leadership sometimes demanded terrible choices. He had seen how love could survive tests that would destroy lesser bonds. He had seen the human cost of wearing a crown. The younger guards who had been shocked, estabiosome, by what they witnessed, had learned lessons they would carry throughout their careers. They understood now that protecting the royal family meant protecting them not just from physical harm, but from exposure during their most vulnerable moments. They had seen behind the pageantry to the real people who wore the titles. And that knowledge made them better at their jobs. In the palace gardens, where Charles and Camilla often walked together, spring bulbs were pushing through the earth. The gardeners who tended them understood the symbolism. After every winter, no matter how harsh, life returned. The gardens had seen centuries of royal dramas, triumphs, and tragedies. They had witnessed wars and peace, love and loss. They would outlast all of it, just as the monarchy itself endured. Charles and Camilla made a point of walking those gardens together regularly. It had become their time to talk freely, away from advisors and staff, away from the weight of their titles. Sometimes they discussed serious matters, sometimes trivial ones. Often they walked in comfortable silence, simply being together. One afternoon in early spring, as crocuses bloomed in purple and yellow patches, Camilla stopped and turned to Charles. She told him something she had been thinking about for weeks. She said that she understood now what her role truly was. It was not just about charity work or public appearances. It was about standing beside him through whatever came, supporting the crown even when it demanded impossible things. Charles pulled her close and told her that she had exceeded every expectation, that her strength and grace had made his reign possible. He told her that future historians might record the decisions he made, but they would not fully understand the sacrifices she made. He wanted her to know that he understood, that he saw her, that he would never take her loyalty for granted. They stood there among the spring flowers. Two people who had found each other against all odds and had somehow managed to build a life together despite obstacles that would have defeated most. The path had not been easy. It had cost them both more than they ever anticipated, but they had walked it together, and that made all the difference. Back in the palace, life continued. The staff prepared for the next state visit, the next garden party, the next royal obligation. The guards stood their posts with professional precision. The machinery of monarchy ground forward as it had for centuries, and would for centuries more. But in quiet moments, those who worked closest to the king and queen consort recognized something important. They had witnessed a relationship tested to its breaking point and seen it survive. They had seen duty and love locked in combat, with both somehow emerging victorious. They had seen the human heart of an institution often criticized as cold and impersonal. The deeply moving moments at the palace were not always the grand occasions that made headlines. Sometimes they were as simple as a king and queen walking through gardens, hands clasped, finding their way back to each other after a storm. Sometimes they were guards standing in hallways, witnessing private pain and choosing discretion over gossip. Sometimes they were staff members working a little harder, being a little kinder, because they understood the burden carried by those they served as spring deepened into summer. Charles and Camilla found joy again, not the careless joy of youth or the passionate joy of new love, but the deeper joy of two people who had walked through fire together and emerged still holding hands. They had learned that love was not just a feeling but a choice, made daily in the face of challenges that never ceased. The story of Charles cutting off Camilla's family would be remembered as a controversial decision, debated by historians and royal watchers for years to come. Some would praise his firm leadership. Others would criticize his perceived cruelty. But those who truly knew what happened, who witnessed the private anguish and eventual healing, understood a more complex truth. They had witnessed not just a king making a difficult decision, but to people refusing to let that decision destroy what they had built together. They had seen duty and love find a way to coexist, however imperfectly. They had seen the monarchy adapt and survive another crisis, as it had so many times before, and in the end, standing in those palace gardens where kings and queens had walked for centuries, Charles and Camilla had found what mattered most. Not the approval of the public, not the perfect resolution of impossible